Chapter 1. Time runs out. Waiting had made the war feel like routine. The dark blue wall of sea and overcast sky stretched into the northern horizon, barely broken by the jagged outline of islands and skerries, a boundary sketched with an unsteady hand. Here and there, faint dots of light punctuated the distance. The rest of the squad sat around a fire, laughing and warming themselves, but Sergeant Suokkala, perched on the damp rock, staring at his phone. The camera and microphone indicator lights flickered to life on their own, as though the device had gained a mind of its own. The screen glitched, flashing erratic lines of code against a blue background. He knew what was happening and tried to power the device off, but nothing responded. When he heard the sound, Suokkala tore his gaze away from the phone and tried to locate its source. The brightness of the screen had robbed him of his night vision, leaving him blinking into the dim twilight. Down the hill, the squad's truck barreled in from the northeast, headlights dimmed as it sped along a narrow service road. Coming from the direction of Sandvik's campsite, Sergeant Adel's group knew something Suokkala didn't. They always knew too much. Suokkala flinched as a flock of crows, perched in their usual spot among the low pine trees of the archipelago, took off with an ugly flapping, cursing their way southward. Away from the sea, as if they knew trouble brewed in that direction. By the fire, the squad rose to their feet. Lieutenant Karski walked over to Suokkala's side. Together, they scanned their surroundings. From the rocky hilltop, they could see in all directions. Far away to the southwest, a flash of light. Not lightning. Too sharp, too quick. A second burst followed, and this time to the southeast, much closer. A black shadow swept across the island, as though brushing against the branches and forcing the light into retreat. Darkness swallowed everything in its wake. The Coast Guard station's power went out. The radar on the tower by the fire stilled. The generator failed to kick in. Sergeant Suokkala's phone died in his hands. He slipped it into his pocket quietly, hesitating just a moment too long. The truck below stopped near the buildings. Sergeant Adel and his group tumbled off the truck bed into the blackness. Their muffled curses carried across the yard to the hilltop, but no one replied. The darkness was too thick, too quiet. But it moved. This wasn't an ordinary shadow. It was something alive. Suokkala felt it in his chest, stopping his heart for a moment. When he looked again, the darkness was gone, but the feeling remained. The same dread that had gnawed at him all day. Something unseen was approaching. It waited. The clouds thinned slightly, and the moon cast a faint blue light across the landscape. "Do you feel it?" Suokkala whispered to Lieutenant Koski. Koski nodded slowly. Figures moved on the horizon, too far to make out clearly. Suokkala's heart pounded in his chest, but not in its usual rhythm. The sound was sharper, more restless. Something was coming, and it didn't belong to the world of men. Shadows glided silently and swiftly across the water's surface, assault boats. They were heading toward the shore. Suokkala could make out their shapes now, barely more than silhouettes, but unmistakable. Soon they would land. The boats moved like living shadows, carrying death in their wake. Fear rose deep within him, clawing up from the pit of his chest, just as it had before. But this was something different. Something worse. "There!" "Spetsnaz!" Suokkala shouted, pointing toward the sky. Something had gone terribly wrong. Why the hell didn't we get any warning? Why would the Russians attack Kokhar? We're completely unprepared. The thoughts screamed inside Koski's head. The fear that had quietly crept into his mind now pounded like a drum. Parachutes directly overhead, not round canopies, but gliders. They had come from high above, silently drifting toward the northeast. It was so quiet that the faint rustle of fabric could be heard, but the sound wasn't unfamiliar. It was old. It was Suokkala. I froze then. I couldn't move. My fault, my child. All those people, Koski muttered aloud. But not now, not here. This was only the beginning. The figures from the sea were getting closer. They knew exactly where they intended to land, inside the breakwater. Koski scanned his surroundings, quickly and intently. His thoughts were racing, working feverishly through the situation. Sergeant Suokkala had never faced anything like this before. The other squad leaders were also waiting, their eyes on Koski now. The weight of responsibility bore down heavily on Koski's shoulders. Sergeant Suokkala, keep your team here. Stop them if they come, Koski said firmly. Then, in a softer tone, he added, the road to the northeast and the tree line to the east behind the buildings. Stay in cover and delay them. Fall back south in time. No heroics. Koski locked eyes with Suokkala. The sergeant nodded tensely, then dropped his gaze to the ground. Koski turned to the others. Adel, flank from the east along the tree line and take care of the paratroopers. Lane, Jock, and I will circle around to ambush the boats from the west. The larger group is heading toward the harbor. They probably think everyone's at the house. Koski's hands seemed to tremble slightly as he gripped his Seiko M23 assault rifle more tightly. He said something, but Suokkala wasn't listening. His thoughts were already darting in every direction. We've got this, Koski assured, though to Suokkala it sounded more like Koski was trying to convince himself. Adel raised his left hand, 2 fingers extended. Without a word, 2 corporals moved swiftly down from the rocky outcrop toward the tree line. Adel waited a moment, then dragged his index finger across his throat in a silent signal. The group vanished behind him in a loose single file into the forest to the east, noiseless as shadows. Koski trusted Adel's reservists. They had seen war and knew how to tread carefully. Koski cast one last hesitant glance at Suokkala. Then he nodded to Lane and led the way down the western slope of the rocky hill at a brisk pace. Lane followed with his team, and Johansson's group brought up the rear. Koski moved quickly, his assault rifle at the ready, eyes locked on the approaching electric boats. They were nearly ashore now, and the team needed to act fast, yet remain invisible in the dark. Johansson and Lane signaled with outstretched arms, and their group silently slipped off the coastal path onto the slick rocks, forming a scattered line. Every step was deliberate, every sound muffled. From the hilltop, Suokkala watched Koski's retreating figure for a moment. Then he gestured for his team to take cover, spreading out in a loose semicircle about 20 meters east of the tower. He positioned himself in the center, lying prone behind a large boulder. The cover was sparse, lichen-covered rocks, stunted junipers, and windswept shrubs. At least they were positioned higher than the forest below. Beside him, the young radio man, Leto, shifted his position nervously, over and over. His head spun with an unreal sense of detachment. It all felt like a bad dream, except the sounds around him were too sharp, too vivid to belong to any dream. Leto could hear everything with eerie clarity. Range 100 meters, Suokkala said loudly, his voice deliberately calm and measured. He scanned the terrain, pointing out key landmarks. Fire at will if they cross over. Left side the buildings 80 meters, center the rocks. 120 meters. Right side forest edge, 80 meters. Keep an eye on the road." "They're not coming down the road," came a dry, distant voice. Corporal Kara, as usual, was right. In civilian life, Kara had been an assistant professor at Aalto University, specializing in quantum-safe encryption methods. Leto, sitting close to Suokkala, swallowed hard. Usually talkative and full of jokes, Leto now seemed a hollow version of himself in every way. His normally pale face flushed, and his hands trembled slightly. "Quiet!" Leto snapped into the darkness. Suokkala kept his eyes on the parachutes, gliding gracefully down from the sky before disappearing behind a rocky ridge and into the forest beyond. They were too far to take a shot mid-descent. Quickly glancing around, Suokkala cursed under his breath. Behind them, the embers of the campfire glowed dimly in the twilight, a beacon for their attackers. Suokkala's fingers tightened around the grip of his old RK-95 TP rifle. He knew he couldn't afford to show fear. The squad kept glancing at him, waiting for orders. "Hold!" he shouted, voice firm and commanding. Suokkala's thoughts spiraled. "Are we ready for this? Can we even do this?" His vision narrowed. The waiting felt endless. In the dimness, there was neither sound nor movement. Then Suokkala saw them first. His heart began to pound, beating out a frantic rhythm. "It's starting now." The first figures emerged, moving in the forest below. They darted in short, crouched sprints, stopping to kneel behind cover between bursts. No one dared fire the first shot. Suokkala bellowed as loud as he could. "The forest! Fuck the forest!" As gunfire erupted around him, adrenaline surged. But it wasn't enough to drown out the terror hammering inside him. The figures in the forest dropped lower, crawling now as they pressed forward. "How long can we hold them?" Suokkala's thoughts raced. "Where the hell is Adele's group?" Uncertainty gnawed at him, but he knew they had to endure. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Suokkala gripped his rifle tighter against his shoulder and tried to aim. He pulled the trigger, firing short, controlled bursts, again and again. The bullets snapped like twins against the trunks of darkened trees. One of the crawling figures made the mistake of rising to a kneeling position. Another burst came from Suokkala's weapon. The first bullet whistled past the target's right ear. The second followed instantly, striking the right cheekbone. It exited behind the ear, tearing away half the face in a spray that scattered far and wide. The remains of the attacker's head twisted violently back under the helmet, like an empty shell, and the body collapsed heavily onto its back. Another figure quickly moved into the fallen attacker's position and did something. But a sound echoed from the forest, like the pop of a large champagne cork. Before Suokkala could fire again, a deafening explosion erupted behind him. The air around him tore apart, his lungs emptied, and he was hurled forward and onto his right side. The world fell silent, save the ringing in his ears. Warmth trickled down his left jawline and neck. From his ear, he twisted slightly, squinting into the darkness. Leto lay nearby, utterly still, a soldier who would never again crack a joke. Adele's group was nowhere to be seen. Something had changed. Suokkala tried to rise, but his legs refused. Looking down, he realized they were no longer there. They ended abruptly where his knees should have been. In their place, a dark, spreading shadow seeped into the earth. Someone walked toward him from the forest. It was the same figure he hadn't managed to shoot, a Russian captain. He drew a sidearm. The man kicked Leto's lifeless body experimentally, then approached Suokkala. He said something, but Suokkala's shattered ears heard nothing. Fuck, is this it? Is this how it ends? Suokkala thought. The captain shot him in the throat and walked on to the next target. Blood surged into Suokkala's lungs. His blood pressure plummeted. A sickening sensation rose, overwhelming even the pain, but it was quickly replaced by dizziness. He felt as if something were pulling him down, dragging him inward, like he was sinking into himself, deeper and deeper, into a dark void. But there was no comfort in the feeling. No peace of falling asleep. Only raw, unrelenting panic. His time was up.